Hi everybody, my name is Matthew Poes with Poes Acoustics, and I'm answering questions in these videos. Kevin David says, is it viable to create a home theater in an attic? It says about living spaces. I think he means above living spaces and expect reasonable levels of sound isolation. Well, Kevin, I think that's a good question, and I want to answer it a little bit differently. So the question you asked is, can you build it in a very specific space and get good sound isolation? Here's a different way to look at it. And that is something that I hear all the time, especially from people from Europe that then come to the US and look at the way we build houses. And that is, can you get good sound isolation when dealing with wood construction? Because that's really what you're asking. And the reason why I say that is, when a basement, you typically have concrete on 2 or 3 of the walls. You have a concrete floor. And what you're mostly interested in is the partition wall and any sound that's able to radiate up to above living spaces. The rest of it already is, because it's the concrete wall with a ton of earth. The mass on those walls is ridiculous. Very little sound gets out. So it's not that hard to achieve pretty high sound isolation in a basement. In an upstairs area, like a main floor or in an attic, which is even above yet, now all of a sudden we have other issues, because now it's sound coming out of the roof, which might bother the neighbors, sound coming out of the outside walls, which might bother the neighbors, sound coming out of the floor down to the living spaces below, which is going to bother occupants. And so there's more we have to do. Well, here's the thing. We can get very high STC levels from wood. It's not a bad material. It's actually, it bends. It's very well damped. With the right construction techniques, you can get a lot of isolation. So the answer to your question is absolutely, of course you can. Are you going to be comfortable spending the money and putting in the effort to do it? Whole nother story. And of course, I can't answer that for you. I have people always ask me, what does it cost? One of these days, I probably need to design a couple of sound isolation systems where I get all the costs. I don't usually see the costs because I design it, I give it to you. I may work with your contractor, but what the contractor charges you is between you and the contractor. I don't see those numbers. Maybe I'll start asking people if I can get the numbers and try to figure out the costs. I actually am working on a project right now with a client, and we need to account for in the total budget the cost of the sound isolation. And the way we're thinking of it, which is probably how most of you would think about it, is if you're building a new space, there's what I call the white box cost. The white box cost is what does it take to make the room a room? Just put drywall up, paint it white, that's the room. Then everything above and beyond that to make it a home theater are the extra costs. And one of those extra costs, which actually goes into white boxing too, to be clear what that term really means, is sound isolation. So it's like, well, we've already got 1/2 inch layer of drywall. So what does it cost to go from 1/2 inch drywall to 5/8 drywall? What does it cost to double the drywall? So it's the labor. Remember, labor might be a little higher because it's heavier too. It depends on the contractor how they're going to charge for that. So the drywall cost goes up. Should not double though. So I'll just say for the drywall guys that are charging twice for 2 layers because it's 2 layers, keep in mind you're not finishing the first layer. So there's no way it should cost twice as much. So you got the 2 layers of drywall, you've got the isolation clips, you've got, there's labor for that, etc. Often there's insulation. Normally we don't put insulation in interior walls, so that kind of increases cost. So all of that stuff increases the cost of doing it. When we get into really high STC levels and we add more places we have to do it to, obviously the costs go way up. So for the floor, you've got those joists, and the joists make the floor for you, it's the ceiling for below. You got to decouple it. Best way to do it, you decouple below and above. So the ceiling below gets decoupling clips, 2 layers of drywall, there's insulation in the rafter area, and then on the top, you've got your layer, your decking, and then you've got your rim, or I did hush frames, so you've got hush frame or whatever. You've got some sort of isolation blocks, basically like springs. You've got insulation, then you've got maybe 2 more layers of decking material. Maybe more. I mean, adding more adds mass, adds improvement. Maybe you add MLV in another layer, something like that. So point is, there's things you do to increase performance above and beyond. So I would argue that you could achieve, not argue, I mean, there's lab data to prove that doing all that can achieve extremely high levels of isolation, and that there would be very little sound that goes below. One of the things you could potentially do, I would confirm with Pabco that they're okay with this, but I mean, you can put drywall on the floor, so I would think it's okay. But you could put Pabco 545, you could put a layer of decking, and then a layer of 545, and then another layer of decking, and you'd have a ton of mass in that floor and probably very high sound isolation. You could do the 545 below. It'd be very expensive, but you would have very, very high sound isolation. You could, again, you can use something like 545, which is the THX drywall, on your inside walls and your ceiling, and you can do decoupling and insulation and the whole deal. On the outside, typically you have a layer of plywood or OSB sheathing. You can do 2 layers. That's what I did in my house. So as you guys might remember from my build, there were some walls that were concrete, but there were some walls that were not because they would actually float. Like the concrete would be floating, and there would be, if I recall correctly, there was no way. I'm trying to remember why we made the compromises, but it was supposed to be concrete all around, and then there was some way it needed to be built for that to be true, and it turned out there was no way to put concrete on these 2 walls because literally you'd have a concrete cinder block wall floating. And what they said was there's no way to make a cantilevered support system that can handle a CMU wall like that, including all the cells are filled with mortar, so very, very heavy. So we went with standard wood construction instead. And then to avoid the compromise, the loss of sound isolation, what we did was we did multiple layers of thicker outer material than usual. So it was a kind of OSB building material that's more watertight than plywood. And we did 3/4 inch, or what it was in the realm of 3/4 inch instead of the 5/8 that's commonly used. And we did 2 layers of it. And all the walls were like, I think, 2x8 or 2x10 or something like that. So then you got insulation, and then you've got decoupling, and then you've got the multiple layers of drywall on the inside. So you get pretty good decoupling, and that's, I'm upstairs. I don't have an attic, so it's actually kind of a similar space scenario to this attic example. There's nothing that says you can't make that high sound isolation. It's just what you got to do. I actually work on projects with clients sometimes where the issues that we run into are that the house is really old and we're trying to sound isolate something that's built to like an old standard, which means that often it's kind of rickety and the windows suck and there's all sorts of issues. Again, no reason why you can't make it sound isolated, but it's going to cost money. You have to take out all the bad stuff. You can't use the rickety stuff. You can't use the windows. With this attic example, there's going to have to be a door. That door has to be a sound isolation door. Just because it's an attic doesn't change that fact. And it probably makes it more important that it's a better door. So the end of all this is that there is no issue. We can do it, but it's probably going to cost money. Obviously, it's going to cost money. It's probably going to cost more money than it would in other spaces. As I said, doing it in a basement is often easier. I would say, though, doing it in a main floor and doing it in an attic are equally expensive ways of doing it if sound isolation is important. I hope this is helpful and you liked the video. Got more coming.